I am Dr. Michael Landis, trustee at the Saratoga County History Center and adjunct professor of history at Hudson Valley Community College. As you may know, Albany Mayor Kathy Sheehan ordered the statue's removal because of Schuyler's career as an enslaver of people of color. Mayor Sheehan's decision is part of a larger international movement to remove or remake monuments and memorials to people with ties to slavery. This new phase of the civil rights movement in the United States has led to a great deal of discussion, debate, and discord over the role of monuments and memorials in our public life, as well as the centrality of slavery and white supremacy to the American experience. Thus, we are gathered together this evening, even amid a global pandemic, to learn from the experts, ask questions, and voice opinions. We have two speakers tonight who will offer comments for about 10 minutes each. As you listen, we encourage you to post comments and questions in the comments section right there in Facebook. At the conclusion of the talks, I will address your questions and comments to Drs. Dorsey and Lawson. Of course, it is imperative that we keep the comments, questions, and the discussion overall respectful, civil, and free of profanity and denigrating remarks. Please keep in mind this is a public forum aimed at education. Our first speaker is Dr. Jennifer Dorsey, professor of history at Siena College and the director of the McCormick Center for the Study of the American Revolution. She received her PhD from Georgetown University and has published widely on slavery and colonial America. Her book, Hirelings, African American Workers and Free Labor in Early Maryland, was published in 2011 by the prestigious Cornell University Press. And most recently, she has published on civil disobedience in the Hudson River Valley in the early 19th century. Our second speaker is Dr. Melinda Lawson, senior lecturer in history and director of the public history program at Union College. She received her PhD from Columbia University and, like myself, studies slavery and politics in the 19th century. Her book, Patriot Fires, Forging a New American Nationalism in the Civil War North, was published in 2002 by the University of Kansas Press. More recently, she published a truly terrific essay on depictions of slavery in Northern theaters. I will now turn things over to Dr. Dorsey.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for hosting this event. I really appreciate that Saratoga County Historical Society is creating a space where we can talk about history education in the Capital Region generally, and what we remember and why we choose to remember it. So I was asked to speak just to offer people a primer about slavery in New York. As Michael indicated, I completed my graduate studies at Georgetown University and spent the better part of my early career in the South and then in Arizona, where the subject of slavery and legacies of slavery are pretty ubiquitous. When I moved to New York, I was really quite surprised about how little New Yorkers knew about the history of slavery in their own backyard. I have been at events where people assume that slavery did not exist here, that it was not part of the origins of New York. I've also, I'll just say that. And so, just to get you started, to just give you some thoughts, I'll just remind you that slavery was in fact part of the New York Project from the beginning. You'll remember, those of you who are interested in the Dutch history of New York, that New York was part of the Dutch Empire in the 17th century, that the Dutch were very significant transatlantic slave traders. They actually owned a monopoly on the trade of moving Africans into the New World for most of the 1600s. And even the acquisition of colonies in North America was meant to forward that project. There was an idea that colonies in the Middle Atlantic would basically provide foodstuffs and way stations for that trade that was facilitated between Africa and North America. And the Dutch West Indies was a company that owned slaves in America. Many of the first slaves who were in New York were actually company-owned slaves. When the English occupied New York, they did not discontinue that practice. They actually had no interest in discontinuing slavery in the Americas. The English had acquired the trade routes from the Dutch and came to monopolize the transatlantic trade in the 1700s. And they similarly, in establishing control over New York, you will remember, gave large swaths of land to the Dutch and the English who were already residing here or migrating here, in effect, to guarantee their loyalty. And with large swaths of land came an additional need for laborers, whether they were African or European immigrants. And so for all of those reasons, slavery was integral to the start of New York and continued to be part of New York's experience through the 18th century. Slavery was not abolished in New York officially until the 1790s by an act of the legislature, but New York also did not pursue a kind of radical emancipation plan. New York adopted what was common in the time, which was a gradual emancipation plan. And the notion behind gradual emancipation was that slaves would become free at the time that they reached their majority. So a baby born a slave on July 4th, 1799 or 1787 would remain a slave until he or she reached majority, and then at that point would be released from slavery. So you had this sort of quasi free status for many Black people in New York in the 1790s. They were born slaves, but the expectation was that they would become free, but they would spend the first 20 years of their lives as slaves, and in effect be conditioned to be second-class citizens, right? A laboring population. So freedom would be a legal status, but not necessarily have a lot of meaning in terms of how they live their lives thereafter. The Schuyler family, of course, has Dutch origins, and they were among the big patroon families, the large landowning families in New York. They were slaveholding families. They were, if not directly engaged in the transatlantic trade, beneficiaries of that trade indirectly, because so many of their extended kinfolk were part of the transatlantic trade networks. You do know, of course, that the Schuyler family owned slaves, and you know that they owned property in Saratoga County, right? That's adjacent to Saratoga National Historic Park. That was a very significant estate where they had slave laborers, free laborers working on that estate into the 1820s, I understand, when slavery was formally ended in New York. Slavery in New York was certainly different than slavery in other parts of the country, or what you would think of as southern parts of the country. Slaves were never a majority. They were never close to a majority in New York, but they were not insignificant in terms of the population. The census from the 1790s indicates that probably about 15% of the people who lived in Albany County were African Americans, either slaves or free. But about 5,000 of the 20,000 people who lived in Albany County in the 1790 census were people of African descent. So there was always a visible presence of Black folk in Albany County in the time of Schuyler's ascendancy in the capital region. Slavery in the Northeast, in places like the Schuyler estate, would have also looked very different in the South than in the South, in the sense that these were not sort of traditional plantation slaves, these images that you have from movies or films. There is a saying in history, which is a problem, I would argue with this saying, that I think they say that slaves were cheap. They were most definitely not cheap. It is very expensive endeavor to hold another human being in bondage, to secure another human being and hold that human being. And so in fact, the people who did own slaves likely had a lot of money and a lot of capital to lay out to acquire slaves and hold slaves. And once they did that, because there were so very few of them, they were usually actually in some kind of skilled trade, right? Because they were in the minority and a lot of money had been invested in securing them. So you would want to give them, you would want them to work in industries that were skilled, because you knew that you would have that trained person for life, in effect. So that is an important distinction between slavery in New York and in other parts of the country. And in fact, the research suggests that there's quite a number of these slaves who went on as free people to start some of their own industries. The Schuyler family, one of the slaves who came out of slavery, I understand, became a tugboat operator in the Hudson River Valley. And there were other, there were other African Americans in 19th century Albany who were involved in this kind of entrepreneurship. And they all had connections to the 18th century patroon families. So that's just sort of a primer, a sort of an introduction to what we know about slavery in New York and in the Capital Region in the 17th and 18th century, to give you a sense of where Schuyler interacts with African American history in New York. I would also, before I turn this over to Melinda, I would say that I guess there's some concern that New York museums and cultural organizations have not been spending enough time talking about slavery. And I would like to say from the start that I really strongly disagree with that. I mean, I do feel that when I first came here, I was surprised by how little people in New York knew about their own history with slavery. But over the years, I've come to appreciate how many of your cultural societies are working really hard to recover that history. And I'm thinking particular of the New York State sites at Cralo and Schuyler Mansion, who in 2015 did a fantastic exhibit about the Dutch slave trade and its connections to the Capital Region. That was a marvelous exhibit. I'm thinking also of Saratoga Battlefield, which very recently has secured a grant to interpret the African American history at the Schuyler estate that's on their property. And of course, even the historic Cherry Hill, Schuyler Mansion, all of these organizations have really made an effort, I would say, in the past 10 or 15 years to recover a lot of this history. And there are plenty of places that people can go in the Capital Region to get that history if they're really, really keenly interested on knowing the Capital Region's African American experience dating back to the slave era. So, Melinda, the food for thought, and I'm as eager as Melinda is to hear what the rest of you all are thinking about this subject. But Melinda.
Okay, thank you. I just want to spend a few minutes talking about, suggesting ways to think about monuments, their creation, and their removal. So monuments are generally created to commemorate a person, to honor who that person was, their values, their actions, and they are generally, not always, but generally in a public space. So what this means is when we decide to erect a monument to honor somebody, to commemorate someone, we think about who that person was that we're commemorating and what it is that they represent. Because these figures in a public space that people frequent are literally on a pedestal. Now, because of all those things, monuments are also what historian James Loewen calls representational battlegrounds. And what that means is they're arenas of struggle because they are in a public space and because they do represent the community on some level. And so people argue over who should be represented in that public space, who it is who speaks to, represents the values of the community. So that's the first point. Monuments are in public spaces. They tend to represent a community. And they're on a pedestal, literally. And so people argue over them. They're representational battlegrounds. The second point that I want to make that I think helps us think about monuments is a point that James Loewen, also a historian who's written quite a bit about public history, has made, and that is that all monuments are the tale of two eras. The first era is the history that is represented. So in our case, that's General Schuyler, and that's the colonial and the revolutionary era. So his values, his actions during that era, that's the first era. The second era, according to Loewen, is the period during which the monument went up. Because what that reflects, the monuments, if they're considered in the context of when they went up, they reflect the values, the thinking of the people, an individual or a group or a community, the people who chose to put them up, the monument up at that time. So the monument is not the history. The monument reflects the decisions, the values of the people during the time it was put up. So I have added to James Loewen's two eras, a third era, which is the era during which we are talking about considering taking a monument down. And like the second era, that thinking reflects our values at this time. So much as the monument is not the history, but rather is a reflection of what people are thinking at that time, the thinking about taking the monument down is not the thinking of erasing history. Rather, it's rethinking whether that person that was chosen to represent the community, in our case, in 1925, whether that is still a person who represents our community, whether we still feel that the values that person represents, that the people in 1925 venerated, whether we still feel that same way. So that's the third era. An additional point I want to introduce, a kind of category of analysis, it concerns the argument about a slippery slope, which is the notion that if we choose to remove the statue of a civil leader, a political leader, a military leader, because that person was an enslaver, that by definition, we will ultimately wind up taking down the statues of people like George Washington. So just a couple of ways to think about that. And one is to consider, to weigh the merits, the accomplishments of the figure against the offenses of the figure, and then to process that through the values of the community at the time. So for instance, if you think about Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Nathan Bedford Forrest was a leader in the Civil War. He fought in the Civil War. He was a lieutenant general, I believe. He also made a fortune selling human beings, African-American human beings, in the antebellum era. He led the slaughter of African-American troops, hundreds of them, troops who were surrendering during the war itself at Fort Pillow. And after the war, and I think he's mostly known for this, after the war, he helped found and was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. So the process of weighing the merits and the offenses of Nathan Bedford Forrest, that's one example. If you were to weigh the merits and the offenses of someone like George Washington, well, then what you're saying is this is a person who was central to winning the American War for Independence. He was central to founding the first constitutional republic. He was the nation's first president, and he owned slaves. At the time of his death, there were 317 slaves at Mount Vernon. Now, many of those belonged to his wife officially, but he was, in fact, an enslaver. So one would weigh that as well. It would look different in the end regardless of the decision, it would be a different process than when you're looking at Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, some communities decide to put up what they call a contextualizing plaque. And that is a plaque, you leave a statue up and then you put up a plaque and it says, well, this figure is here. He was put up during this period. We don't necessarily share these parts of his values. So that is something sometimes people wind up doing with a figure they feel does in the end still represent something, or actually when there are laws forbidding them. So in the South, you've got a lot of laws that say you can't take statues down. And so people put up these contextualizing plaques. Now, coffee. If we look at all these cases, all these factors, and you apply them to the Schuyler Monument, the statue stands in front of City Hall. And in that sense, it's in a public space. And so it represents Albany. It represents the city. It looks as though, it appears as though it represents the city's values. So in terms of the first era, Schuyler was an important general in the Revolution. He was a New York State senator, and he was an enslaver. He was the largest enslaver during the late 18th century in Albany. So those are the things that one would weigh. And then one would think about whether, how this weighing fits into who we as a community are today. So now let's talk about the second era. So that was the first era. The second era, this statue was actually put up in 1925, and I looked these things up. So in 1925, according to historian Jennifer Lemack, less than 2% of the Albany population was African American. The men, women, and children who constituted that 2% faced regular and systematic discrimination in housing and education and employment. And here is something that I learned from writer Lawrence Gooley, who writes about the Adirondacks, who said that also during the 1920s, there were 11,000 members of the Klan in the Albany area. So this is a very different time. 1925 was also a period during which the nation was loath to think very deeply about slavery, certainly did not recognize how violent the institution of slavery was. So it is a very different time. It is unlikely that the decision to put up a statue of Schuyler would have encountered opposition. And even though the African-American community was organizing to protest during that period, organizing to protest the discrimination it faced, those were not voices that would have been heard had they said anything about the statue. Those were not voices that were valued during this period. So that's the second era. So let's fast forward now to the third era. This is the era in which we are contemplating removing these statues, or this statue. Philip Schuyler is in fact on a pedestal, as I said. He therefore represents the city. Roughly 1/3 of Albany's population are African American. The mayor has spoken with members of the community who say when they walk by that statue, they feel like they don't belong in this community. The nation is starting to talk about the real nature of slavery. It's a process. A lot of people don't want to look at it, but the nation is beginning to. And as this takes place, we think about, does Schuyler represent today, standing right in front of City Hall, who we are as a community? So just to quickly recap those categories, and then I'm done and we can open this up. First of all, monuments are in a public space. They're on a pedestal. They represent the community and its values because they are in those public spaces. Monuments are the tale of two eras: the period during which, the history that is being commemorated, and the period during which they went up. They're reflective of the values at the time. The third era, the period during which the monuments are considered, we're considering taking them down because we're not clear that we share the same values. And then I mentioned the slippery slope argument, the sort of weighing the merits and the offenses of the person, and then asking ourselves whether that person is in fact representative of our community today. So that's pretty much what I wanted to do, just introduce some categories, some ways to think about the issues. I'm done.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Lawson. We have a question from Facebook. This can go, I guess, to Dr. Lawson since it popped up while you were speaking, but Dr. Dorsey is welcome to chime in as well. Question is, are flags considered the same as statues? And the references to the Confederate flags coming down. So are they equated, or is that a whole different category?
Well, it's a really interesting question. And I think the answer would be, in a way, both, right? I mean, they are a different category, but I'll tell you the way in which they're not. They're a tale of two eras, because the Confederate flag, the Confederate battle flag, is flown during the Civil War, but it does not make a significant public appearance until the Civil Rights Movement. So during the Civil Rights Movement, you have states that suddenly change their flags. Georgia, which has gone through all these different flags, suddenly puts the Confederate flag on its flag. The flags start appearing everywhere. So I would argue that while they are very different in that sense, you're not erecting them to in the original. There's no second era in that sense, but there is an era in which these became prominent public statements. And that happened in direct opposition to the Civil Rights Movement. So they are similar. Jen, do you have a thought?
On flags, I do not have a thought.
All right, we've got another question about, and this could go again either way, about, and this is something that I've heard a lot, which is that it's inappropriate for us to use today's, this references the categories that Dr. Lawson came up with, that today's morals should not be applied backwards, that Schuyler and people like him were not thinking the way we think today, and thus we need to keep people in history locked in their kind of moral categories regardless of where we are. So perhaps another way to phrase it is the third category that Dr. Lawson referenced is perhaps not appropriate because it's going backwards. Any thoughts on that?
I'll just say two quick things, and the first is there were actually, I always point out, there were people at the time, many of them, who said slavery was wrong. There were abolitionists. Of course, it ended in the North after the Revolution, although New York was the last state to do so. So it's not entirely about us bringing us values, our values to bear. Having said that, I think there's also a point to be made about a monument per se. So independent of the way we are judging the person, because I'm not sure that's really the point, as much as the question of whether that person now represents our values. So the point of the second era is that that is not sacred, that if you were to move into a house and the owners of the house had put a little statue up front because they liked it, and it offended you, you would feel no obligation as somebody who comes around later and now it's your house to keep it because it was at the original property. Now, I'm sure that analogy is flawed on many, many levels, but the point is that there's nothing sacred about a statue that some people in 1925 chose to put up if that statue is in a public place, which I think is really a critical point here, such as in front of City Hall, and in being there is representing Albany. So in that sense, I'm slightly separating out judging the person from, do we have to leave the statue up?
I would second most of that. I do think it'd be worthwhile for most people to consider what they do think Schuyler represents today, right? I mean, that's what one of the things Dr. Lawson's saying is that what he represented in 1925 may not be what he represents in the present. He may not reflect our values in the present. So for people who are interested in preserving the statue or keeping it where it is, I would like to know, really, what do people think that Schuyler represents? Beyond being a slaveholder, beyond being a military general, maybe these are things that the military piece, I mean, certainly we have a lot of veterans in the community, maybe they identify with that piece of Schuyler. But what is it that we as a community identify with when we look at that Schuyler image? So does that make sense? I mean, is what the people who are interested in preserving that statue, whether it sits in that location or another, you know, what is it that we're holding on to, I guess? if anybody has any thoughts about that, I'd be interested to know.
It's good that you asked. We actually just learned that we have descendants of the Schuyler family attending this event. So from what I understand, they plan on issuing a family statement tomorrow. So perhaps tonight they might want to weigh in and give us a sneak peek about that. In the meantime, though, we got another question. Is there evidence that the Klan played a role in the erection of the statue?
I'm not muted, right? No. And in fact, I wanted to emphasize that I am not, I realize that that might sound like it's similar to what's happening with Confederate statues, because of course the daughters of the Confederacy, not the Klan, but the Daughters of the Confederacy are all over the country erecting statues. Rather, I was trying to make a point about the period that we are treating as sacred. So absolutely no evidence that the Klan played a role, but the decision, and people aren't thinking in terms of equality during that period. They're just not. Hence the Klan, hence Jim Crow in the South and our own versions of it in the North. So, but absolutely no evidence that I'm aware of that the Klan had anything to do with it. But I'm glad the question was asked, because I think it's an important distinction.
Well, we have a question from a member of the Schuyler family who wants to know, does it matter, this is not from a Schuyler descendant, it's from someone else, does it matter what the Schuyler family has to say? I mean, so what role should they play in the memory, the public memory of this figure, if any at all?
I have thoughts, but I'm talking a lot. So Jen, do you want to weigh in, or?
Does it, let's see. I mean, certainly the history of the Schuyler family is represented in the Capital Region in multiple sites, right? Certainly at Schuyler Mansion, it is represented. Certainly it is going to be the story of Philip Schuyler is told at Saratoga Battlefield, and now Saratoga Battlefield is committed to interpreting his estate, where they'll be able to talk more about his domestic life and his commercial enterprises. So I don't know the descendants of the Schuyler family. I mean, I would hope that they're in communications with those two communities and or those two public history entities, and sharing how they feel, I guess, about how their family history is portrayed. I would also add that Schuyler's papers are available at the New York State Library, and manuscripts and special collections. And any citizen in the state of New York can walk into the New York State Library in manuscripts and special collection and flip through his own writings. I actually did this with students a couple of years ago. I brought them and I had them transcribe letters that he had written with his daughters. So there's plenty of spaces and places where people can go and learn more about Philip Schuyler, either from historians who are interpreting that history for them, or they can DIY and go to the New York State Library and do it themselves. But that probably doesn't say much speak to the Schuyler family, but I mean, I can understand how a family would be keen on making sure that their ancestor, who for a very long time has been venerated in this community, that the things that he was venerated for are not entirely lost in this moment.
And I think that made the important point, which is the notion of public space. That is, having a statue right in front of City Hall makes a statement about what Albany is and makes a statement about what it is we're valuing. And so there's been, my understanding, and this is just from reading, is that the mayor would like to keep the statue in Albany. And I don't think there's any sense that we're erasing the history of the Schuylers at all. Rather, that perhaps that is not the statue that belongs in front of City Hall, because this is now 2020. It's not 1925, and we think differently. We embrace diversity, we embrace equality, and that he presents issues along those lines. That does not take away from his accomplishments in Albany, somewhere else. So I think that that Jen made the important point, that there's public space that is representational. And in that sense, that's what that is.
All right, next question. What about, alternatively, what about leaving controversial statues up and discussing how we did things then versus now? So essentially leave them up as teaching points, if you will, as examples of how times have changed. This person asks, can't we better educate people about historical nuance if we leave them up rather than yank them?
So during the debates on Nathan Bedford Forrest, there was this great quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, the African-American intellectual, and he said, I don't want to lose the opportunity, he didn't say it in exactly these words, so I'm not quoting, but he said, I don't want to give up this teaching moment, that I don't want people to forget, he said, that there was a moment when we thought it was a good idea to celebrate Nathan Bedford Forrest. So that very much speaks to that point, right? The problem is, then you're looking at contextualizing plaques, which I mentioned in briefly. The problem is that those are plaques that are pretty small, right? And they're often right beside massive statues. So that the thing about Nathan Bedford Forrest is you could see him from the highway. People would drive by, and the story of people walking by with their children, trying to explain why this guy is a statue. The plaques are not going to be read by many people. They are not. So I do think there is theoretically a teaching mechanism there. There was a moment when people thought it was a good idea to celebrate Nathan Bedford Forrest, and that does matter. Leaving that statue up, you have to weigh the number of people it's just making feel that they don't belong, that we're celebrating a guy who thought selling people was a good idea, that thought massacring African Americans was a good idea, not Schuyler. This is about statues in general. And whether leaving them up doesn't continue to perpetuate some of the same things because people are not going to read the plaques, or not everyone is.
If you don't mind, if I interject just a little bit of my own experience, you said that we put up and we do this or that, and if any of my students can tell you, the most hated question I ever ask in class is, who is we? So I think that's also part of the discussion is when we put up a monument, I think we're talking about, and this is issues that James Lowen has raised, who has the money to put up these plaques, right. Who's in charge of the city council, who makes those decisions. It's often not we, but a very select few of people who have the cash and the money and the influence to make those decisions for everyone else. So I'm not trying to overly complicate things here, but I think your points lead us to other points about who makes these decisions for us as a community and who gets, yeah. All right, so we've got more questions.
Can I speak to that for just a quick, just a hot minute? I used to be for recontextualizing, and now I'm not so sure I am for recontextualizing. But even if I wasn't for recontextualizing, you know, I think the point about geography is a good one, right? This statue is one of two, I believe, that sits between the legislature and City Hall. And these are two institutions that are committed to civic engagement, to the democratic enterprise, to the Republican project dating back to 1776. I do think it is appropriate to have somebody who represents the Republican project, the Revolutionary Era project, sitting in that space. But I wonder if we could even find a different New Yorker from the same era who was very much committed to the spread of democracy in New York in the 1780s or the 1790s or the 1800s, who might better speak to those values. You know, we are committed to community engagement in democracy and civic participation. DeWitt Clinton comes to mind. William Seward comes to mind. You know, people who fought actively to bring more people into the political process in the Revolutionary era and the immediate post-Revolutionary era may make better candidates for a monument in that space that's very much committed, dedicated space for the people's voice, right? The legislature and the city hall. So that's not a common, I mean, Schuyler was a Federalist. Schuyler was not necessarily engaged in politics that would have been pro-little d Democratic. He would not have been somebody who advocated for bringing more people into the franchise. New York was one of the states that actively pushed for broadening the franchise, right? This is where Seneca Falls happened in 1848. This place did extend the vote to African Americans early. It then changed it, and then it changed it back. This was a state that under William Seward's governorship was very hostile to slavery in the southern states. I just wonder if there are better candidates, even from the age of the American Revolution, right, at a time when values were very different than our own, which was the point that somebody made in the chat. There were people back there whose values were closer to ours, who would be really great candidates for that space.
All right, great. Thank you for adding that. I'm going to read now a question that is rather complicated, so I'm going to read it verbatim from the comments. So just bear with me. Here's the question. It's a comment that might lead to a question, but I want to be fair to the people who are commenting here. Just 1 second. Chris Churchill says, quote, "The irony of that banner behind a slave owner was obvious. The contrast was too big to hold," end quote. But what Churchill has failed to recognize is that irony is the most powerful teaching tool. The irony of a patriot that sacrificed in order to pave the road for America, a country that welcomes debate and the influx of new ideas when looked at in his historical context, is an opposition that sparks meaningful debate. Dickens and nearly all the great writers and artists have used this sense of contrast and irony in order to highlight social injustices. It is the most powerful tool we have. Furthermore, once a statue is put into a museum, it is made more a symbol of elite, creating a culture where any person who cares to learn the complex past and not just a cartoon history must pay. Removing the statue does not allow the public the opportunity for education. Removing him from the square, sciences make it all too easy to forget the complicated and complex past to which America was born. That was the two comments linked together. Oh, from a descendant of the Schuyler family.
I think that that's really interesting, and I think that irony is often not recognized, and while theoretically it's a good teaching tool, much like the contextualization plaque, it's my belief that people are learning in a less nuanced way, and therefore, and are interpreting rather in a much less nuanced way. That is, that it continues to be the case that a statue exists and is seen as someone who should be venerated, as opposed to the kind of sophisticated processing that that questioner is describing. And I know that sounds, I just think that there are many people who will not process it on that level. So I love the comment. I think it's really interesting. And my concern would be that too many people would not process it on that level. That's.
All right. A follow-up question. We got a couple more here. If we're going to take the Schuyler family into account, as we are right now, shouldn't we also seek out the descendants of their enslaved people? Do we need to balance that out, or can we take one without seeking the other?
I don't think we can take either one when it comes to the public space. And I just feel that a public space, we have, in a public space, it's making a statement about the community. And I think that when I describe the difference in the population, when I describe that it's a different culture, we have a different set of values, I think we have to read that on the level of who Albany is today. And actually there's a debate in public history which for people who are watching and don't know, because a lot of faculty that I work with don't know, public history is history taught outside the classroom. So we're talking about monuments, museums, movies, all these things where people learn their history and they're not learning it in class. A big debate is, what is the role of survivors? So when you have the Holocaust Museum set up, there's a whole book Edward Linenthal wrote about how the decisions are made and the role that the survivors have in shaping those decisions. So in the end, it becomes an issue. But when you're talking about what best represents a community, it's not clear to me that survivors per se are what matters as much as how we understand the larger community. I mean, they're part of that larger community. So, but in my mind, it's the larger community. Jen, what do you think?
So if I understand correctly, somebody's proposing matching that sculpture with a different sculpture that celebrates survival. Is that what I understand, Dr. Landis?
I think that I just asked previously if we should take the Schuyler family into account, and then we just read a comment from them and then essentially brought them into the conversation as a party that has an interest here. But are we doing a disservice by not also seeking out and getting, quote unquote, the other side of the story, if you will?
What is the other side of the slavery story?
The way the question's framed, it seems like the enslaved people who were enslaved.
I think they mean, if
I see. Should we
slaves, which I think would be very important. I just am more concerned less with specific of survivors than with the community at large and what we now embrace, which is not at all to devalue the contributions of either one. I'm just thinking more general. I'm sorry, Jen, I interrupted you.
No. I think if your comment, if the audience member is making the case that we need more public acknowledgement of African American history in Albany city spaces or the county of Albany, I commend that. I totally agree with that. It's remarkable to me that I think in the whole city of Albany there is but the one statue for Henry Johnson. Is that correct? And I think that was recently put into that space. It is at a distance from tourist areas, right? I mean, the thing about the Schuyler sculpture or monument is, that's prime real estate between City Hall and the legislature, and not far from a walking distance from the new thoroughfare of the arts and restaurants and things like that. And yet there's nothing comparable to represent the other third of the city, right? If 1/3 of our city population doesn't recognize the history of Schuyler in their own historical experience in Albany, I think it is a worthy project to create more monuments, or more monuments that young children of diverse backgrounds can look at and go, oh, I identify with that historical character, right? Whether it's women or African-American children, or we have an increasingly growing Asian population in Albany, right? I mean, is it not appropriate that they too should be represented in the public sculptures in our community?
So let me just quickly interject, because obviously Jen's answer was a better answer in as much as you took it in the direction of input into public history, which I think is really important, and I completely agree with you. So I guess my point was the concern that the community at large, we would take them into consideration as opposed to specific people within it about the statue, which is in front of City Hall. But Jen's absolutely right. The idea that we would have more diversity in our representation is very important. So.
All right, we got a question about Little Phil Sheridan. Did that come up and I miss it? We got a question about Sheridan's being memorialized. So.
Yeah, I forgive me. I'm looking down and I'm scrolling through the Facebook page, and I do see that somebody raised the issue of the Sheridan sculpture, which some people, or not sculpture, it's a monument to Philip Sheridan, who is of course a Union Army hero, right, and justly so. A couple of years ago, that that monument was vandalized, and coincidentally, it was vandalized on Columbus Day. And I think that only the historians in the community recognize the significance of that vandalism. Philip Sheridan was an active participant in the Indian Wars. The Albany elite families were actively supported not just the Indian Wars, but the active movement of Indian children into white households and Indian boarding schools. This is well documented. New York State has a history of Indian boarding schools. I think, and that statue, if I remember correctly, is walking distance from the Philip Schuyler statue. So if we're going to reconsider Schuyler, I think we might want to also revisit the, Sheridan, and that may also be a monument that we want to, at minimum, reinterpret, since there is such a large Native American presence in New York. Native Americans are integral to the history of New York. Still constitute a sizable constituency in this state. You know, is it appropriate that Native Americans should have to come to their capital city in the state of New York and walk by the Sheridan monument, knowing what that represents for them? And I would add one more monument that I think we should reconsider, and these are all outside the Revolutionary era, so I feel happy to throw them all under the bus. And that is a monument to the veterans of the Spanish-American War, which was America's first foray into imperialism. That monument is located, I don't know if you know where that is. It's very close to Washington Park. And I don't know how well people know that story, but that is a war that was America's foray into white imperialism. It was the origins of this notion of the white man's burden in America, go out into Asia and go out into Africa and start bringing American values. And that's another monument that I'd like to see recontextualized, considering its location and what it represents.
Just to clarify, when you say recontextualize, you mean leave it up but have different words and plaques and symbols associated with it? Just to clarify.
Yeah, I mean, Melinda may feel differently, but that's a veterans monument. So I don't know, maybe it's different with veterans? I don't know. You don't?
I don't feel differently.
Okay.
Are we still live?
As far as I know. Are we still live? Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. I think we had a little glitch there, but I think we're still live.
Okay. I don't disagree with you.
That it should be recontextualized?
A contextualization plaque that that it gives some context to why that statue went up, what its significance is.
All right, well, so I got a couple more questions here, but before I read those, I'll say to the audience, this is your chance for last comments and questions. As much as we would love to do this all night long, I think got other families and dogs to tend to, and maybe some cats. So please post your comments and questions now so we can hopefully get to them in a timely fashion. All right, next question. Has there been any previous calls for removal of the Schuyler statue, or is this just a brand new thing? Is this just like a trendy 2020 thing, or is this a long-term effort? Does anyone know? I'm
not aware of any previous calls, but that doesn't mean they weren't there.
I've, as a member of the history community, and Melinda's part of the history community, we spend our time with archivists and librarians and other museum professionals and historians. And I've heard more concerns about the Sheridan than I have about the Schuyler monument. But so, yeah, I don't know if this has been brewing for some time and events caused Mayor Sheehan to act on it.
Well, should that give us pause, just to play out this person's question for them? Should the fact that this is relatively new, then let's say this hasn't been publicly brewing for quite a while, that should we handle this with more discretion then, rather than say the Jeff Davis statue in Richmond, which has been a a problem for ever?
My understanding is that people have spoken to the mayor for some time, that is not brand new. So that while a public discussion of this statue or a call to take it down, as far as I know, hasn't come up before, apparently this is not a new concern. And I believe it was 2005, and if somebody knows differently, please correct me, that the skeletal remains of some of the enslaved men, women, and children of Schuyler were discovered. You guys know this? I think that was 2005. So it has been in the public mind that there were slaves, and we know that one of them, several of them ran away. I mean, there have been pieces of this story that have come out over time. And so it wouldn't surprise me that there have been concerns expressed to the mayor over the years. So it's not, in other words, brand new as a concern.
So Melinda, our colleague Erin Noble at the New York State Museum just posted on Facebook that, in fact, evidently Mayor Sheehan has been receiving concerns for a year. And that was part of her statement last week.
Yes, so that's not a brand new thing. I also don't think, because something happens at a time when there is, as we all know, a crisis that has brought about this new way of thinking, it strikes me that the points I was trying to make about the difference between 1925 and the present, that doesn't change, right? This is a very different time and has been for years. And we are facing, in a way, the brutality of slavery. And we are recognizing more and more what that history looked like. And we're embracing egalitarian ideals more. So, and it's a third of the population. So in my mind, even if these are new, no, that wouldn't give us pause, because as I see it, those sort of categories of analysis that I talked about lead us to that conclusion, because that was a decision that people made many years ago, and we are very different as a community. So even if they're relatively recent, I would still think that this is called for.
I would say I understand that there is interest in moving this statute to another location, either within the community or within the city. For what it's worth, some people might know, Melinda might know this story, that when India secured its independence from Great Britain, it desperately wanted to get rid of all of its monuments related to the British Empire. Totally understandable, right? They did not want to memorialize these characters that they associated with oppression. They, didn't want their children growing up looking at these images. They wanted them growing up looking at the heroes of the Indian Revolution. And so they basically offered them for sale, and Canada bought them all up because Canada, was the Canadians are proud, or many of them are proud monarchist, and we're happy to have all of these statutes. And I don't think there's anything wrong with such a migration of monuments, right? A monument that doesn't necessarily have a lot of value in one community may be very well prized in another community. And there might be something to that. I think that's been ruled out in this case, but it feels like that's worth a community should have that conversation, be allowed to have that conversation.
All right. I'm going to condense several comments and questions into kind of a three-part single question that won't surprise you. So here are the three parts. Where does it stop? Do you next rename Schuylerville? And if you're going to rename Schuylerville, who would be righteous enough to be memorialized instead? So do you have an opinion about, if we're going to get rid of the statue and then get rid of Schuylerville, who instead?
So, well, on the one hand,
where does it stop? When does it end?
So on the one hand, that is part of the slippery slope argument. Having said that, by my standards, which involve public space, it would be legitimate if the town of Schuylerville wanted to think about that. I'm really committed to the notion that a statue, we'll just continue the statue, that goes up in a public space that it is representative, right? That it represents something. And that if a community decides that doesn't represent us anymore, then they can take that down. The slippery slope argument, again, I use those criteria, but if you're sticking with Schuylerville, of course, that doesn't matter. So I would argue that if the town of Schuylerville started saying something similar, then that's a legitimate process, but that's Schuylerville's. That's the people and whether they're feeling like he represents them. And I thought about the idea of substitutes, and I did not come up with something. I thought about it beforehand. I thought Jen did a good job coming up with some other people who might go up, but I don't have a good answer to that.
I forgot, right, where does it stop? You know, one of the people in the Facebook page asked, is there a statute of limitations or something to that effect? Is there a lifespan for monuments? And if there's not, maybe there should be. People might remember that Thomas Jefferson believed that every law and constitution should basically have the lifetime of a generation. Right, which is a really radical idea. But this idea that sort of every 25 to 30 years, laws that old should be revisited, and the community should be asked, are these still relevant or useful, right, for the world that we live in now? And I think maybe there's something sort of similar that happens with monuments. I don't know, that's right, but certainly, as I tried to indicate, you know, New York has a long history of contributing to the spread of democracy and civic engagement. We have any number of people that we could memorialize in that space between City Hall and the legislature that we would all take pride in. I really do think that we could find somebody that we could have some consensus around, right? And maybe it is every generation is entitled to their own statutes in the same way that they are entitled to laws that serve them.
I mean, I like the idea because it is about, does this person represent who we are as a community? And again, it's about where it is in my mind. If it's as centrally located and representative, therefore, of the city of Albany, I think that the community has to embrace those values on some level. So a generation, we've been through many since then, since 1925.
I've had several people talk to me about this, and almost all of them have asked about the Hamilton connection. So I feel I would be remiss if I did not also bring that up. I have sadly not seen the musical. I will hang my head in shame. But I cannot afford to go down to Broadway. But apparently, Schuyler is treated very well in the musical. So, do you think is that part of the conversation? That on the one hand, he is connected to this beloved founding father, and then now we're kind of taking him down. I mean,
I in my public history class, I taught the play Hamilton. So. Part of that, because this is what historians do, was to say, what did they choose to remember and what did they choose to forget? So phenomenal piece of art, phenomenal play. And they chose to forget a lot about Schuyler and the fact that they had slaves and the fact that Angelica apparently had slaves. So there's a lot of forgetting going on there. And so I don't think that a consideration of the role, there's also a lot of forgetting about Hamilton, who was an elitist, who was a militarist, who did not believe that the people ought to be able to rule, who with the Alien and Sedition Act said immigrants ought to have to be here 14 years because they don't share our values. So, I mean, I don't think the Hamilton...
Supported child labor.
Yes. So I don't think the Hamilton connection should make a difference in our decision. I do think that the Schuyler House is a wonderful historic house, and it teaches us increasingly, they're doing a good job of educating us about who Hamilton was. And so I think those two exist at the same time, that you have a desire, we have a desire to take the statue down, and we have Schuyler House where you go to learn about Philip Schuyler. So that's kind of another point, but I'm just saying, I don't think Hamilton ought to play a role, and I think we should continue to learn about Philip Schuyler.
Would you guys put this up to a vote? I think one person who's watching suggested a referendum. Is that an option?
For a referendum among whom?
I guess a vote in the community, the greater Albany area. I mean, I don't think they were specific, but the idea that a community can vote on the fate of a memorial or monument?
I'll just say this very quickly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jen, which is, when the way that processes often work, democratic processes often work, is that we've elected an official, right? And that official has executive power legally to make a decision like this. So whether that decision would be made through a referendum, I'm not sure what I think, but the way the decision was made was how democratic governance often works, right? People exercise, Congressman makes laws, Congresspeople make laws. People exercise the power they're given. They're democratically elected people who exercise the power. So in its own way, this is a democratic decision, small d. What do you think, Jen?
I think the decision having been made, I think that it would be wise on the part of the leadership of the city of Albany to convene interest groups and historians to consider how they do want to reuse that green space, right? If we're taking one thing down with an eye towards putting up something, that whatever that next thing is should be a point of consensus. I would really hope that the community can rally around whatever next goes up in that space. So there could be some healing around this and how it was done, but also the potential to sort of bring the community together for everybody's children to be able to walk by that monument and see themselves in it and see this moment in it, and bring their children and their grandchildren to that space, and everybody has equally warm feelings about whatever is put in there next. That is not going to be done by fiat. That will require community conversations led by skilled historians and community leaders.
I like it.
All right, I've got to bring up another issue that has come up many times, and that is the issue of slavery in New York versus slavery in the South. For a lot of New Yorkers, I think there's a sense that slavery here, especially in the colonial period, was perhaps nicer, perhaps better than slavery elsewhere. Can, I guess, Dr. Dorsey, you might want to start with this address. Is there a difference? Should Schuyler be put in the same category as a Southern enslaver?
I mean, slavery is slavery is slavery. I mean, whether it's happening in 2020 or 1920 or 1720, I mean, it is the commodification of another human being, right? It is trading in the lives of other people for your own profit, right? And even if you acquire enslaved human beings in a benign way, I inherited them, they were marriage presents, right? As opposed to, ripping them from the shores of their communities. It takes a lot of energy and brute force to keep one human being enslaved to another human being. And there are great testimonies written by New York slaves about how damaging the experience of enslavement was to them physically, emotionally, spiritually. Sojourner Truth's narrative, her memoir, is one of the most, she's a New York slave, right? And deeply, deeply scarred by her experience. So no, the fact that slavery did not exist on the same scale does not mean that it was any less violent, exploitive, degrading. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, this is an important point. I think perhaps that there's a sense that the colonial slavery was perhaps nicer, or northern slavery was more genteel, rather than, and I think I might be overstepping here, but I imagine that the average person, when they think about slavery in the South, they're thinking of the cotton plantations in Mississippi in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and they think, well, that couldn't have been upstate New York. But so your point is that regardless of the crop or the century, the brutality of slavery is consistent, and that Schuyler should not be given a lighter treatment because of his time period and his location?
Yes, I would agree with that. And I would agree that the legacy of slavery, post-emancipation world, if there's this notion that New York is better because in New York discontinued legal slavery in 1790s, 18 teens, and 1820s, that makes them therefore better. In fact, it just means that we started our segregation earlier, we started our redlining earlier, we started disenfranchising Black folk earlier, we started criminalizing their conduct earlier. There's plenty of evidence that many of the Jim Crow practices that were picked up in the South in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s had roots in places like New York, New Jersey, in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, right? A lot of the prejudices, New Yorkers brought a lot of prejudices to the South in the post-Reconstruction era.
Okay, well, we've reached towards 8:30 here, so we've still got comments coming in, but more comments than questions. Do either of you want to have any final thoughts? There's some consternation, I think, on Facebook that we're perhaps not speaking, or we're speaking for a community in which we do not live, or that we're furthering an agenda that is more political than scholarly, or perhaps that we're rushing into things. So any final thoughts on that before we bid adieu?
I think people are disadvantaged right now because they can't get to their museums and they can't get to their libraries and they can't get to their historical societies. But I do want to restate my position in the beginning of this conversation, which is that our local historical societies, the New York State historic sites, the federal sites, we are all actively working to create sites that are friendly to diverse perspectives, that speak to different perspectives, that help people manage their discomfort around subjects like slavery and segregation. And I would urge people, to make of this moment, make a commitment to visiting these sites and learning what they can about New York history and slavery in New York and African American in history in New York. There are plenty of resources available to those of you who want to know more. And as for the politics of it, I'll tell you what I tell my students: write your congressman, write your assemblyman, write your city councilman. That is your right. I urge you to do that. Exercise the democratic rights that people fought and died for you to have.
And I just completely agree. Educate oneself about this. I like the idea that people might consider those different ways to think about monuments that I suggested and process what Jen is saying through those as well. And so, yes, that's pretty much it for me as well.
All right, well then I think we'll end it for this evening. For those of you who are still on Facebook, you're welcome to keep posting your comments, and the museum director or myself, or if there's specific comments to either of our speakers, we can forward those to them, or you're welcome to go on the school websites, and if you have more specific comments directly for someone in particular, as long as they're polite and respectful, you're welcome to contact your local history expert. And of course, when the doors open at museums, we welcome you back with social distancing and with masks. So let us say goodnight.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we are clear.
Oh, I'm sorry, Michelle. I just got your text.
That's okay.
You're much better at that stuff than I am.
It's all right. I think we're off.
Yeah, Whitney said that there was one last quote. What was the last question?
Good.
It was a positive thing.
Yay. Oh, here, I can return my picture. Oh, you have to talk to the big purple.
Who said that? Does anyone know a Colleen Thorne? They apparently really like us.
No.
Are we definitely off?
It says we're not. It says we're recording, but we're not live. Michelle, do you want to turn off recording?